I want to be careful about how I tell this, because I know how it sounds. I know what you're already thinking, that I'm going to describe some haunted apartment, some demon in the walls, some creature that crawled out of the dark. I'm not. What I'm going to describe is much worse than that, because I still can't explain it, and because the people who should have been able to explain it chose not to. I moved into the Weldon Arms in October of 2019. If you've ever had to find an apartment in the middle of a month with bad credit and a security deposit you scraped together from selling your car, you'll understand why I wasn't picky. The Weldon is one of those mid-century buildings that's been repainted so many times the window frames don't close properly anymore. 6 floors, cinder block and plaster. The lobby smells like radiator steam and something faintly chemical that I later learned was whatever the super used to mop the tile. There's a bulletin board near the mailboxes with a single outdated notice about recycling policy, and it's been there so long the paper has yellowed into a kind of parchment. I took Unit 4C, 4th floor, east facing. 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a gas stove from the 1980s and a refrigerator that hummed in a key I eventually stopped hearing. The rent was $1,100 a month, which was below market for the area, and a man named Garza, told me it had been empty for a few months. He handed me the keys with the disinterested efficiency of someone who had done this several hundred times and did not find tenants particularly interesting. The first few weeks were fine. They were more than fine, actually. After the separation, after the months of sleeping on my brother's couch in Bridgeport, having my own space again felt like surfacing from water. I bought a mattress from one of those online companies. I set up a desk in the corner of the bedroom for my laptop. I had a remote data entry contract with a medical billing firm, so I didn't need to commute. Most days I woke up, made coffee, sat down at the desk by 7:30, and worked until 4 or 5. Then I'd cook something simple, or walk to the Vietnamese place on Caldwell Street, and come back and read or watch something on my laptop until I fell asleep. It was quiet, not peaceful quiet, structural quiet. The building had thick floors, poured concrete between the units. You could hear the plumbing sometimes, and the elevator shaft ran along the west wall of my apartment, so I'd occasionally feel the faint vibration of someone going up or down. But I rarely heard my neighbors. The woman in 4B, directly next to me, was elderly and mostly stayed in. I'd see her at the mailboxes sometimes. We'd nod. The unit on my other side, 4D, was occupied by a man I saw maybe 3 times in 4 years. I don't know his name. He worked nights, I think. So the building was quiet, and I was quiet, and that was fine. I first noticed the warmth in December. December in that part of the state is brutal in a boring way. Not dramatic cold, just relentless gray dampness that gets into everything. The Weldon had radiator heat, the old cast iron kind with the knob valves. Mine worked, but it was uneven. The bedroom stayed warm enough. The kitchen was always a few degrees cooler. The bathroom was freezing in the mornings until the pipes had been running for a while. One night, I think it was around the 15th or 16th, I was lying in bed reading, and I put my hand up against the wall behind my headboard. I don't remember why. Maybe I was adjusting the pillow, and the wall was warm. Not hot, not alarming, just noticeably warmer than it should have been, like something on the other side was generating heat. I assumed it was the radiator pipe running up through the wall, which would have made sense. Old buildings route their plumbing through shared walls all the time. I went back to reading and didn't think about it again. A week later, I noticed it on the ceiling. I was lying on my back in the dark, not quite asleep, and I opened my eyes and looked up the way you do when you can't sleep and you're just staring at nothing. And I became aware, slowly, the way you become aware of a sound that's been playing for a while before you consciously hear it, that the ceiling directly above my bed felt warm. I don't mean I could see heat or anything like that. It was more like a presence of warmth, a faint radiance. Like the ceiling was a few degrees warmer than the surrounding air. I got up and touched it. Stood on the bed and pressed my palm flat against the plaster. It was warm. Not a lot. maybe 5 or 6 degrees above what you'd expect from an interior ceiling in winter, but definitely, unmistakably warm to the touch. I told myself it was the heating system. Hot water pipes ran through the floors, and the building was old enough that the insulation between units might have been minimal. Heat rises. The unit above me probably had its radiators running, and the warmth was bleeding through the floor into my ceiling. That was the obvious explanation, and I accepted it immediately, because it was simple and it made sense. What I didn't think about, not then, was that I'd never heard anyone in the unit above me. Not once. Not a footstep, not a door closing, not a television, not a toilet flushing. Nothing. In almost 3 months of living directly below it, Unit 5C had been completely, perfectly silent. I brought it up with Garza about a week later. I didn't bring up the warmth. I didn't think it was worth mentioning. I just asked casually, while he was replacing a washer in my kitchen faucet, whether anyone lived above me. He didn't look up from the faucet. 5C? No. That one's been empty a while. How long? Few years. Maybe longer. He finished with the washer, tested the faucet, dried his hands on the rag he kept in his back pocket, and left. That was the extent of the conversation. A few years. Maybe longer. I filed it away and didn't ask again. Not immediately. But that night, I lay in bed and pressed my palm to the ceiling again, still warm. And now that I knew the apartment was vacant, had been vacant, I didn't have a ready explanation. No radiators running. No tenant generating body heat or running hot water. No reason for the floor of an empty apartment to be warm enough that I could feel it through 8 inches of concrete and plaster. I told myself there could still be a rational cause. Maybe a hot water pipe ran through the floor slab and the building kept the water circulating even in empty units to prevent freezing. That was plausible. That was in fact the most likely explanation. I let it go. For a while. January was cold enough that I started paying closer attention to the heat in my apartment. The radiators were on a building-wide schedule. They'd come on around 6 in the morning and shut off around 10 at night. During the day, my apartment was comfortable. At night, it cooled down gradually, and by 2 or 3 in the morning, I'd sometimes wake up and pull the blanket tighter. But the ceiling stayed warm, consistently. Even at 3 in the morning, when the radiators had been off for 5 hours and the temperature in my apartment had dropped into the low 60s, I could press my hand to the ceiling above my bed and feel that same gentle warmth. It didn't fluctuate. It didn't correspond to the building's heating schedule. It was just there. I bought a cheap infrared thermometer from the hardware store on Meacham, the kind you point at a surface and it gives you a reading. I started taking measurements. I didn't do it obsessively. I wasn't that kind of person yet. But I'd check once in the morning and once before bed. The ceiling above my bed was consistently between 78 and 82 degrees Fahrenheit. The rest of my ceiling, the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, ranged from 65 to 70, depending on the time of day and whether the radiators were running. A 12 to 15 degree difference, localized to a roughly 6 by 8 foot area directly above where I slept. I started sleeping in the living room for a few nights on the couch. I told myself I just wanted to see if the warmth followed me. It didn't. It stayed over the bedroom. Over the bed. Over the exact spot where I'd been putting my head every night for 3 months. I went back to the bedroom after a week. The couch was uncomfortable, and I'd started to feel foolish. It was a warm spot on a ceiling in an old building. There were 100 possible explanations, and I didn't have the expertise to evaluate any of them. I was a data entry contractor, not a building engineer. But I started listening more carefully. I don't mean I pressed a glass to the ceiling or put my ear against the wall. I just mean that, in the quiet of the apartment, late at night, I began paying attention to what was above me. And for a long time, the answer was nothing. No sounds. No vibrations. No evidence of anything at all, until February. It was a Tuesday night, around 1 in the morning. I'd been having trouble sleeping, not because of anything specific, just the general insomnia that had followed me since the separation. I was lying on my back in the dark, and I heard something. It wasn't a footstep. It wasn't a creak or a thud or any of the sounds you'd associate with someone moving around in an apartment. It was more like a settling, like the sound a house makes when the temperature changes. That slow, deep tick of materials expanding or contracting. Except it wasn't a single sound. It was a series of them, spaced maybe 4 or 5 seconds apart, moving from one side of the ceiling to the other. Tick, pause, tick, pause, tick, slow. Deliberate sounding, although I know that's my interpretation and not necessarily reality. It moved from above my bedroom doorway to above the window, and then it stopped. I lay there for a long time, not moving. The warmth was still there. I could feel it on my face, radiating down from the ceiling like a low-grade heat lamp. The sounds didn't come back that night, but they came back the next night, and the night after that, always between midnight and 3. Always that same slow, measured progression across the ceiling, always stopping near the window. I went to see Garza on a Thursday morning. He was in the basement, doing something with the boiler. I asked him again, about 5C. What about it? You said it's been empty. How long exactly? He thought about it, or pretended to. Since 2013, I think. Maybe 2014. The last tenant moved out and they never filled it. Why not? Couldn't tell you. Management decides that, not me. Is there any reason the floor up there would be warm? Like, is there a pipe running through it, or could be? These old buildings, the plumbing goes everywhere. You having a heat problem? No, the opposite, kind of. The ceiling above my bedroom is warm. He looked at me for the first time during the conversation. Not with concern, exactly. More like he was assessing something. Then he shrugged. Probably a return line. Hot water loops back to the boiler through the floor slabs. Nothing to worry about, even if the unit's been empty for 6 years. Water still circulates. System doesn't know if someone's living there or not. It was a perfectly reasonable answer. I thanked him and went back upstairs, and I almost left it alone. I almost just accepted the hot water return line theory and went on with my life. But that night, when the sounds started again, tick, pause, tick, pause, I got up, put on my shoes, and went into the hallway. The hallway on the 4th floor was carpeted in a dark maroon that had been worn down to near flatness in the high traffic areas. The lighting was fluorescent, 2 tubes for the entire length, and one of them buzzed faintly. I walked to the stairwell and went up 1 flight. The 5th floor was identical in layout. Same carpet, same fluorescent tubes. But only one of the lights was on. The far end of the hall was dim, not dark, but dim enough that the door numbers were hard to read. I walked down the hall to 5C. The door was closed. I don't know what I expected. I pressed my ear against it and listened. Nothing. No sounds. No ticking. No settling. I put my hand flat on the door. It was warm. Not the handle. The door itself. The wood. Warm to the touch, like something behind it was generating heat. Not a lot. Just enough to notice. Just enough to feel wrong. I stood there for maybe 2 minutes. Then I went back downstairs and went to bed. The ceiling was warm. The sounds had stopped. I didn't sleep well. Over the next few weeks, I developed what I guess you could call a routine of observation. I wasn't obsessed, or maybe I was, but it didn't feel like obsession at the time. It felt like due diligence. Something in my building didn't make sense, and I wanted to understand it. That's a normal impulse. That's what a reasonable person would do. I started noting the temperature readings more carefully. I bought a small notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, and I recorded the ceiling temperature twice a day, along with the ambient temperature in my apartment and the outside temperature from the weather app on my phone. I logged the sounds when I heard them. The time, the duration, the direction of movement. Patterns emerged. The warmth was remarkably consistent. It barely varied by more than 2 degrees regardless of external conditions. The sounds happened 3 to 5 nights a week, always in the early morning hours, always following the same path across the ceiling. And there was one other thing I noticed. though I hesitated to write it down because I wasn't sure I wasn't imagining it. The warm spot was getting larger. In December, when I'd first noticed it, it had been roughly over my bed. By February, it extended a foot or two past the bed in every direction. By March, it covered most of the bedroom ceiling. I measured it by standing on a chair and moving the infrared thermometer in a grid pattern, marking the boundaries where the temperature dropped to match the rest of the ceiling. The warm area was expanding at a rate of maybe an inch or two per week. I started having trouble sleeping, not because of the warmth, or not entirely. The temperature was actually comfortable. It was more that I couldn't stop being aware of it. I'd lie there and feel it pressing down on me, this invisible thermal presence, and I'd think about the empty apartment above me and what could possibly be producing that kind of sustained, localized heat with no apparent source. And the more I thought about it, the less the hot water pipe theory made sense. Pipes don't heat an expanding area. Pipes are fixed. They run in straight lines. Whatever was warm up there, it was spreading. In April, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I waited until Garza was out. I'd learned his schedule by then. He left the building on Tuesdays and Thursdays for a few hours in the afternoon, and I went up to the 5th floor with a screwdriver. Not to break in. I just wanted to see if the door to 5C was locked. It was dead-bolted from the feel of it. The knob didn't turn. I knelt down and looked at the gap under the door, and I could see the edge of the floor inside. Bare hardwood it looked like, and it was clean. Not dusty, not dirty. Clean the way a floor looks when it's been maintained. That bothered me more than the warmth. An apartment that had been vacant for 6 years should have had dust on the floor. Should have had that stale, closed-up smell. Even through the gap under the door, I should have sensed some evidence of neglect. Instead, there was nothing. Just clean floor and warm air drifting under the door like breath. I went back downstairs and sat at my desk and didn't work for the rest of the day. I pulled up the property management company's website, a company called Linden Property Group, and searched for any listing for Unit 5C in the Weldon Arms. Nothing. It wasn't listed as available. It wasn't listed at all. As far as the website was concerned, the unit didn't exist. I counted the units on the 5th floor. The building had 4 units per floor, a through D. The website listed 5A, 5B, and 5D as occupied. 5C simply wasn't there. I told myself it was a website error. Property management companies aren't known for their attention to digital detail, but I screenshot the page anyway and saved it to my desktop. I emailed Linden Property Group the next day from my personal email and asked about the availability of Unit 5C. The response came 3 days later from a generic address. Thank you for your inquiry. Unit 5C is not available for lease at this time. Please see our website for currently available units. Not available. Not vacant. Not under renovation. Not available. May came. The warm spot now covered my entire bedroom ceiling and had begun extending into the hallway. The sounds had changed. They were still the same slow ticking progression, but now they sometimes continued past the window, past the wall. They'd move across the ceiling of the bedroom, into the hallway ceiling, and then stop. Sometimes I thought I heard them continue into the living room, but I was never sure. By the time I got up to check, they'd stopped. I wasn't sleeping well. I was eating less. My work was starting to suffer. I was making errors in the billing codes, transposing numbers, missing fields. My contract supervisor sent me a form email about accuracy metrics. I read it, closed it, and went back to staring at the ceiling. There was one night in late May. I remember this clearly because it was the first warm night of the year, and I had the window cracked open. When I woke up at 2 a.m, and the warmth was different. It was stronger, not burning, not uncomfortable, but noticeably warmer than it had been. I grabbed the infrared thermometer from the nightstand and pointed it at the ceiling. 91 degrees. I sat up. I pointed it at the wall. 74. The floor. 70. The ceiling again. 91.3. I got out of bed and checked the hallway ceiling. 85. The living room ceiling. 81. The kitchen. 76. A gradient. A gradient of warmth radiating outward from whatever was directly above my bedroom. I put on shoes and went upstairs. The 5th floor hallway was warmer than the 4th. Not dramatically, maybe 5 degrees, but I could feel it. I walked to 5C and put my hand on the door. I pulled it away. The door was hot. Not warm. Hot. The kind of temperature that makes you reflexively withdraw, like touching a car hood on a summer afternoon. I stood in the hallway and listened, and for the first time, I heard something from inside the apartment that wasn't ticking. It was a hum. Low, steady, almost below the threshold of hearing. Not mechanical. It didn't have the regularity of a machine. It wavered slightly, like a tone being sustained by something organic. Like a long, continuous exhale through a very narrow space. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then it stopped, and the hallway was silent again. I went back to my apartment. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with the lights on and waited for morning. At 7:30, I called Linden Property Group. I got a receptionist who sounded like she was barely awake. I told her I was a tenant at the Weldon Arms and that the unit above me was producing excessive heat, and I wanted it investigated. She asked for my unit number. I gave it. She asked me to describe the problem. I said the ceiling of my apartment was abnormally warm, and I believed it was coming from 5C. There was a pause. Then she said, "I'll put a note in the system. When can someone come look at it?" "I'll put a note in the system," she repeated, in exactly the same tone, and then asked if there was anything else she could help me with. Nobody came. Not that week, not the next. I called twice more. The second time, I got the same receptionist, and she told me there was already a note in the system. The third time, I got a different person who told me that maintenance requests for common building systems were handled by the on-site superintendent. So I went back to Garza. I told him about the heat. I told him it was getting worse. I told him the door to 5C was hot to the touch, and I'd heard a sound from inside. He was replacing a light fixture in the 3rd floor hallway. He didn't stop working while I talked. When I finished, he said, "I'll take a look." "When?" "When I get to it." "Garza, the door is hot. Something is wrong up there." He looked at me then, held the look for a moment. I said, "I'll take a look." A week went by. I asked him if he'd checked 5C. He said he had. And didn't find anything unusual. The door was hot. I touched it. Building runs warm in the summer. It's not summer yet, and it's been warm since December. He didn't respond to that. He just looked at me with that same assessing expression he'd had the first time I'd asked about the apartment, and then he went back to whatever he was doing. I started to feel like I was losing my footing. Not mentally. Not yet. But socially. I was the guy complaining about a warm ceiling. I was the tenant who wouldn't drop it. I could feel myself becoming a category in Garza's mind. Difficult tenant, problem resident. And some part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime avoiding conflict, the part that had stayed too long in a marriage because I didn't want to be the one to say it was over, that part wanted to just stop, just accept it. Just live with the warm ceiling and the sounds and the locked door and not ask any more questions. But I couldn't. Because in June, something else happened. I was coming home from the Vietnamese place on Caldwell Street. It was around 8 in the evening, still light out. I walked up to the building and looked up the way you sometimes do when you're approaching a tall structure, just a casual upward glance. There was a light on in 5C, not bright, not a lamp or an overhead, more like a glow. A warm amber luminescence, visible through the window, as if something inside was producing light at a low intensity, like a candle, but steadier, like a heating element. I stood on the sidewalk and stared at it. A woman walking her dog passed behind me, and I barely noticed. I stared at the window for maybe 3 minutes. The light didn't flicker. It didn't move. It just glowed, faintly, from inside a room that had been empty for 6 years. I went inside and up to the 5th floor. The hallway was warm. The door to 5C was warm. I pressed my ear against it and heard nothing. No hum. No ticking. Nothing. I knocked. I don't know why I knocked. It was instinct. You see a light, you knock. Nobody answered. I knocked again, harder. Nothing. I went back outside and looked up. The light was still there. I went to my apartment. The ceiling was warm. I lay down on my bed and looked up at it. And I noticed something I hadn't noticed before, or maybe something that hadn't been there before. In the center of the warm area, directly above my pillow, there was a discoloration. Not a stain, exactly. More like a subtle darkening of the paint. As if the plaster underneath was changing color. As if something was seeping through from above, not liquid, not moisture, just warmth made visible. A shadow of heat. I touched it. It was the warmest spot on the ceiling, 94 degrees according to the thermometer. I moved my bed that night, pushed it against the opposite wall. I lay down and tried to sleep, but I could still feel it, the warmth spreading across the ceiling, radiating down. It didn't matter where the bed was. It didn't matter where I was. The warmth was expanding to fill the room. In July, I did something I'm not proud of. I waited until 3 in the morning when the building was completely quiet, and I went up to the 5th floor with a flathead screwdriver and a flashlight. I worked on the lock of 5C for 20 minutes. I don't know how to pick locks. I was just jamming the screwdriver in and trying to turn it, which is not how lock picking works. I didn't get in. But while I was crouched there, working on the lock, I felt something that made me stop. The air coming from under the door was warm. Wasn't new, but it had a smell. Faint, barely there, but distinct. Not decay. Not chemicals. It smelled like skin. Like the warm, slightly salty smell of human skin after sleep. The smell you'd notice if you pressed your face into someone's neck. I pulled back from the door. I stood up. I stared at the door for a long time. Then I went back downstairs and called the non-emergency police line. I told the dispatcher that I believed someone was living in a vacant apartment in my building and that the unit was producing abnormal heat. She took down the address and said someone would come by. 2 officers showed up the next afternoon. I met them in the lobby and explained the situation. They were polite, but clearly not particularly concerned. I brought them up to the 5th floor. One of them touched the door to 5C. "Feels normal to me," he said. I touched it. He was right. It was room temperature. For the first time in months, the door was not warm. They knocked. No answer. They said they couldn't enter without permission from the property owner or evidence of an emergency. A warm door was not an emergency. I asked if the building management could let them in. They said I'd need to contact the management company. I'd already contacted the management company. The management company had put a note in the system. The officers left. I went back to my apartment. The ceiling was warm, 89 degrees above my bed, which had become the new normal. After the police visit, I started doubting myself. Seriously doubting myself in a way that felt less like healthy skepticism and more like the early stages of something clinical. I started wondering if the warmth was real. Not in the abstract. I had the thermometer readings. I had the notebook full of data, but real in the sense of being externally caused. What if there was something wrong with me? What if I was running a fever and projecting it onto the ceiling? What if the thermometer was malfunctioning? What if I was so isolated and so fixated on this one thing that I'd lost the ability to perceive it accurately? I bought a second thermometer. Same readings. I asked the woman in 4B, Mrs. Delaney. I'd learned her name by then. If she'd ever noticed anything unusual about the building's heating. She said no. I asked if her ceiling ever felt warm. She looked at me like I'd asked her if the moon was following her and said no. I didn't ask anyone else. August. The warm spot had covered my entire apartment ceiling. Every room. The bathroom, the kitchen, the hallway, the closets. A uniform 85 to 90 degrees across every square foot of ceiling. My apartment had become noticeably warmer than it should have been, even for summer. I was running a window fan constantly. My electric bill doubled, and the sounds had changed again. The ticking had stopped. Instead, there was a new sound, so faint that I wasn't always sure I was hearing it. It was a rhythm, not mechanical, not musical, organic. A slow, steady pulse, like a heartbeat, but much too slow. Maybe one beat every 4 or 5 seconds. It came from the ceiling, from everywhere in the ceiling, and it was constant, day and night. It never stopped. I just couldn't always hear it. But when the apartment was quiet, when the fan was off, when I held my breath and listened, there it was. A pussy. Slow, deep, and warm. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom. I stopped sleeping in the apartment, mostly. I'd nap in my car in the parking garage, or doze in the lobby if I thought Garza wasn't around. I went to the library during the day and sat in the reading room and stared at nothing. My work contract was terminated in mid-August due to accuracy issues. I didn't fight it. I barely noticed. There is one more thing I need to tell you about, and then I'll be done. In September, I came home from the library and found an envelope under my door. Not in my mailbox. Under my door slid through the gap. Plain white envelope, no address, no name. I opened it, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a printed, not handwritten, printed message. Renewal notice. Unit 5C lease term. Continuous. Tenant. Blank. Status. Occupied. No signature. No letterhead. No date. The paper was warm. I took the elevator to the 5th floor. The hallway was warm. Warmer than it had been in months. I could feel it as soon as the doors opened, like walking into a room where someone has been breathing for a very long time. I walked to 5C. The door was warm again. Not hot this time, but warm, steady, alive feeling. I pressed my ear against it. The pulse was there. Slow, deep, patient. And underneath it, so faint I might have imagined it. I accept that I might have imagined it. I heard breathing. Not labored, not raspy, just breathing. Calm even, restful breathing. Like someone sleeping. Like someone who had been sleeping for a very long time and was in no hurry to wake up. I stood at that door for, I don't know how long. 5 minutes. 10. The breathing didn't change. The warmth didn't change. The pulse didn't change. I went back to my apartment. I packed a bag. I took my laptop, my notebook, my thermometers, my documents. I left the furniture, the mattress, the kitchen stuff. I walked out of the Weldon Arms and I didn't go back. That was 3 years ago. I live in a different city now. A different state. A ground floor unit in a small complex, no one above me, no one below me. I sleep fine. I work fine. I don't hear pulses or ticking or humming. My ceilings are the temperature they should be. But there are 2 things I haven't been able to stop thinking about. The first is this. About a month after I left, I looked up the Weldon Arms on Google Maps on the street view. The building looked the same. The windows looked the same. But when I zoomed in on the 5th floor on the window that would have been 5C, I saw the glow. That same warm, amber glow, visible even in a daytime photograph. I checked the image capture date. It was from 2016, 3 years before I moved in. The second thing is harder to talk about, and I've gone back and forth about whether to include it. But I think I have to, because otherwise this account isn't complete. Last month I went to a doctor for a routine physical. Everything was normal except one thing. The doctor said my core body temperature was slightly elevated. Not a fever, not enough to indicate illness. Just a fraction of a degree above what's considered normal. She said it was nothing to worry about. Probably individual variation. She said some people just run warm. I didn't tell her about the Weldon Arms. I didn't tell her about the ceiling, or the sounds, or the pulse, or the envelope. I just nodded and said, "Yeah, I've always been a warm sleeper." But I hadn't been. Before the Weldon, I'd always run cold. My ex used to complain about my cold feet in bed. I wore socks to sleep 9 months out of the year. I was the person who brought a jacket to the movie theater. I don't wear socks to bed anymore. I don't bring jackets to movie theaters. I am, in ways that I cannot explain and do not want to examine too closely, warmer than I used to be. And sometimes, late at night, in my new apartment with no one above me and no one below me and nothing wrong with the ceiling, I'll lie on my back in the dark and put my hand on my chest. And I'll feel my heartbeat, and I'll count the seconds between beats. It's slower than it used to be. Not by much. Not enough for a doctor to comment on. But I count. And I remember the pulse I heard in the ceiling of the Weldon Arms. And the interval is getting closer. I don't know what was in that apartment. I don't know what was generating the heat or making the sounds or filling the space with that slow, patient warmth. I don't know why Garza wouldn't talk about it, or why Linden Property Group pretended the unit didn't exist, or why the police couldn't feel what I felt. I don't know who slid that envelope under my door, or what the lease renewal meant, or who the tenant was. But I know the ceiling was warm. I know what I measured. I know what I heard. And I know that whatever was in that apartment, it was not empty. It was full. It was full and warm and alive and waiting, and it had been waiting for a very long time. And I know one other thing, though I wish I didn't. It's closer now than it was when I left. I don't mean geographically. I don't mean it followed me, not in any way I could map or track. I mean that when I close my eyes and breathe, and when I feel my own warmth radiating off my skin into the dark air of my bedroom, I understand, in a way that I cannot explain and do not want to, that the distance between me and whatever lived in 5C is not a matter of miles anymore. It's a matter of degrees. And every day, the number gets smaller.